After completing the breakdown and summary section of this dashboard, let's add the last missing pieces, which are the performance KPI tiles right at the top. The goals for these tiles is to provide contextual information and summarizing insights that let us better evaluate and understand our performance in the selected year and period. Let's build these tile by tile, and in the first tile we want to display the selected year and period just like we already do in the section header, but visually way more prominent. As we have the selected year and selected period values already available as referenceable names, we can directly start with creating that tile by copying over one of the existing tiles from the budget tracking sheet and then positioning it right aligned to the left edge of our breakdown section. To make the transition between these two worksheets as visually smooth as possible, let's try to bring this to the exact same position as this first tile in the budget tracking sheet. For that, we switch back and forth and slightly adjust the tile position each time until we have achieved the perfect transition without any shifting. After that, let's decompose this tile to modify its individual components. At first, we make this tile background element a bit wider like this, as we're gonna need a bit more space in here. Then we also increase the size of this text box and change this title to Selected Year and Period. Instead of displaying the year and period value in a simple text box, let's remove this and insert a rounded rectangle shape instead. For this rectangle, we set the roundness of the corners to the maximum and then right-click on it in order to open the Format Shape section on the right. We set the fill to white and the borderline to this dark blue. And then close that section again to adjust the size and proportions of the shape. Let's jump up here and play around with different values for the height and width. And I think for displaying the selected year, this is an appropriate size. So let's link that shape's text content to the selected year value in the formula bar. There it is. It still looks a bit off, so let's align this text to the center and middle, reduce the font size to 10, and make it bold. Now it looks pretty clean to me, so let's find a good position for that shape within the tile. And right after that, we're gonna duplicate this shape to also display the selected period right next to the year. Let's align both shapes to the top, then increase the size of this second shape, as the selected period text will probably take a little bit more space, and eventually change the value reference to Selected Period Display. Due to this updated reference, we need to readjust the font size and the bold text style. And that's it for this tile. Let's see if everything works fine by changing the selected year and period. And here we can see that one major advantage of this tile is that even when we have selected those dynamically calculated current month and current year options in the drop-down fields, this new tile prominently tells us what the current year and current month actually are. Of course, this tile also updates correctly for any other selected year or selected month. And what is also important, even those longer period names like September or November perfectly fit into this period shape. That means we are ready to regroup those tile elements and move on with the creation of the second tile, which will display how much the selected period has already progressed in time. So how much of the period is already over? That will allow us to better evaluate the percentage completion for each individual position in our breakdown section, as these can now be set into perspective. Before we create that tile, let's first set up the underlying calculations to determine the selected period's progress in the calculations worksheet. And before we get into that, let's quickly straighten up the alignment of that selected period value. Okay. And now down here, to calculate which percentage of the selected period is already over based on the current date, we first need to calculate the number of days that exist in that period, then the days that have passed in that period, and then by combining both we will get the percentage value. For the calculation of total days in the selected period, we need to differentiate between the calculation of days in the total year and days in a specific month. If the selected period is total year, then we can determine the number of days in the total selected year by composing a date for the last day of the selected year, which is the 31st of December, and then subtracting the date representing the last day in the year before the selected year, so the selected year minus 1. That way the number of days in the selected year is always correctly calculated, even if that year is a so-called leap year that has 366 days. Alternatively, in case the selected period is not total year, but a specific month instead, then we can calculate the total days of that month by making use of the EOMonth function, which stands for end of month. That function returns the date value of the last day in a month before or after a specific number of months. That means it expects us to put in a start date value for which we provide a composed date with the selected year as year and the selected period as the month, and a random day number like 1 for the day. And then we could potentially define an offset in months that we want to apply to that date, but since we want to stay in this exact month, we simply enter an offset of 0. And finally, since this end of month function returns a date value, we still need to extract the day number from that date by wrapping the whole expression into the day function. Let's close that if statement, hit enter, and as you see, with the selected period being set to total year, the total number of days for the selected year 2022 is returned as 365, which is correct. When we jump over to the dashboard worksheet and change the selected year to 2024, which is a leap year, the formula correctly returns 366 this time. That's amazing. And when we change the period to the current month, for example, which is March, the formula correctly returns a total number of days of 31, while for February in 2022, it also returns the correct value of 28 total days. So as this days in period calculation seems to be legit, let's set the selected period back to total year and continue with the days passed in period calculation. As we're going to need to differentiate between a lot of different cases in that calculation, let's add a bit more space in the formula bar and start the formula off by checking if the selected year is the year of the current date. That is an important first check, because only if that is the case, we actually need to calculate something that is different from either 0 or the total number of days in that period. So in case the selected year is the current year, then we need to check if the selected period is total year, because in that case we need to return the total days that have already passed in this year so far. And this number can be calculated by simply taking the current date and subtracting the date of the last day in the previous year. Alternatively, in case the selected period is not total year, but a specific month, then we need to figure out if that selected period is the current month. so the month of the current date. In that case, the days passed in this current month are calculated as the day number of the current date. Otherwise, if the selected period is a month before the current month, then that month has already fully passed, and thus the return value equals the total number of days in that period. In case the selected period is not smaller but greater than the current month, then this period obviously hasn't started yet, and the days passed in that period are 0. With this, we can now close the 3 inner if statements, and now can focus on the value if false calculation for the initial if statement. If the condition of that initial if statement returns false, that means that the selected year is either smaller or greater than the year of the current date. In case it is smaller than the current year, then we follow the same logic as we have already done for the month and return the total days of that period as all of the days have already passed. Otherwise, in case the selected year is greater than the current year, that year hasn't started yet and the days passed in that year are 0. We can now finally close that whole statement. I know these were a lot of nested if statements, but this construct was necessary to cover all the potential cases. With the current date being set to the 15th of March, the days passed in the total year of 2022 are now correctly returned as 74. When we jump over to the dashboard sheet and change the selected year to a year after the current year, the formula correctly returns 0. When we, for example, select a month that is before the current month, then the days passed are correctly set to the total days in that month. When we set it to the current month, it correctly returns the current day in the month. And finally, when we select the month after the current month, then the formula correctly returns 0, as this month technically hasn't started yet. So this days passed in period formula also works perfectly fine, which now allows us to calculate the percentage of days passed in the period as the days passed in period divided by the total days of that period. And of course, this is supposed to be formatted as a percentage value. Great! With this calculation setup, we can now jump over to the dashboard worksheet and create that second tile. And as a blueprint, we're going to take that first tile from the budget tracking worksheet again, as this comes closest to the tile that we want to build. For aligning it to the position of the selected year and period tile, let's just place it at the lower position, then select both, and in the Shape Format tab, click on Align Top. It makes sense to first ungroup all the elements before we modify them one by one. Starting with the size of the tile background, which we're gonna slightly reduce. Then we change the title to a shortened form of period completed. And then we change the referenced value of that value text box down there to the percentage value that we have just calculated back in the calculation sheet. Let's readjust the text style to be size 12 and bold. And also align it to the center for this tile. And then we're going to reduce the size of the text box and recenter it within the tile shape by selecting both elements and in the Shape Format tab, clicking on the Align Center option. To finalize this tile, we want to add a progress bar, just like we have done for the percentage completion values in the breakdown section. For this one, however, we can't make use of the conditional formatting data bar option, as we want to place this on the foreground of the tile shape. Instead, we need to create an actual bar chart based on the percentage value in the calculation sheet. For this, let's select a random empty cell in the sheet, so we can insert an empty horizontal clustered bar chart with no data in it. And then we go to the Chart Design tab, click on Select Data, and then select the single percentage value which produces this simple bar chart. To normalize the proportions of the bar, let's manually set the x-axis maximum to 1, which equals 100%, and after that we select the whole chart area to remove the fill and borderline. And then also remove any other element in this chart area except the bar itself. Of course, we still need to adjust the fill color of that bar to match the lighter gray that we have used for the percentage completed data bars in the breakdown section. And finally, to make this bar fill out most of this chart area shape, let's reduce the gap to 0%. When we then also reduce the height, that leaves us with a shape that comes pretty close to the cell-based data bars in the breakdown section. So let's move that over to the dashboard worksheet and adjust its size and position within the tile to be perfectly centered around the percentage value when fully filled. To do this in the most efficient way, let's put the value text box in front of the chart by opening the selection pane and dragging it on top of the chart element. And then we can reposition the chart, adjust its size to better match the proportions of the data bars in the breakdown section, and once we have aligned it to the text box vertically, we select both the chart and the tile shape to also center it horizontally within the tile. Perfect. Let's select all elements of that tile and group them together. And as this value is supposed to serve as a comparison value for the percentage completed values in the breakdown section, let's align the horizontal tile position to these data bars by moving it down, then making sure that the center of the progress bar in the tile matches the center of these percentage completed cells, and then just realign it vertically by also selecting the other tile and making use of the Align Top option. That's it for the setup of the second period completion tile, and you can instantly see the main value of that tile is that we now have a comparison value for all those percentage values in the breakdown section. And that gives us a good approximation for every position if it is behind or ahead of the curve. Let's continue with the next tile that will display the selected period's tracking balance, so the delta between the tracked income and tracked allocations to either expenses or savings, but only those effective in the selected period. Let's start by calculating the period tracking balance in the calculation worksheet first. And at first you might think this is a complicated thing to do for the selected period only, but the good news are that we have all the values we need for that calculation already available, because they are in the chart data tables for the category distribution charts. In these data tables, we have already dynamically calculated the total tracked income, the total tracked expenses, and the total tracked savings effective in the selected period. So this calculation is as easy as taking this total income value and subtracting the sum of this total expenses value and this total savings value. There we go. As the selected period is total year right now, it is no surprise that this period tracking balance equals the total tracking balance up there. And as we also want to have a similar analysis text in this new tile, let's just copy down these two cells, and as the cell reference has been set up relatively, it automatically references the correct cells with the period tracking balance value above. So it either returns this or this text based on the balance's sign. That's all we need. Let's jump over to the budget tracking sheet and simply copy over this tile for the total tracking balance. As for this one, we only need to change the title and the references in the value text boxes to turn it into the period tracking balance tile on this dashboard worksheet. For vertically aligning it to the other two tiles, let's just place it a little below them, then also select one of the other two tiles, and then align both to the top. This time we won't even need to ungroup these elements and can directly start with changing this title to period tracking balance, then changing the reference for the balance value to this newly calculated value in the calculation sheet. Let's restore the font size of 12 and the bold text style. And after that, we also update the reference for this analysis text to now refer to the one that is actually related to this period tracking balance. Here we also need to restore the intended font size of 10.5. Maybe we can even slightly reduce the size of this text box and of the tile background shape. And that is it for this third tile. Let's see how this tile value behaves if we change the selected period to January. For that one, it returns an evened out period tracking balance of 0, as obviously the income tracked for this period perfectly equals the tracked allocated amounts to expenses and savings. The same is the case for February, and as in our sample data setup we are only halfway through the current month of March, here we still have a lot of tracked income that is left to be allocated. Wonderful. That means we can now move on to the creation of the fourth and final tile, which is also the final component of this whole Excel template. In this final tile we want to display one of the most crucial KPIs in personal finance, which is the savings rate. Just like for the other tiles, we're gonna calculate the savings rate for the selected period. And technically there are two fundamentally different ways to calculate the savings rate in this template. And I think it makes sense to enable whoever uses this template to decide which way of calculation is a better fit, maybe also depending on the situation. So let's jump over to the settings worksheet and create a new title in here for decisions about the ways KPIs are calculated in the dashboard. And the label for the decision field will be savings rate as percentage of income, because that is how the savings rate is always measured, as a percentage of the disposable income that is saved within a period. Let's quickly copy down this drop-down field and change the names of the available options while I'm gonna explain the two different ways of calculating the savings rate. As the savings rate is calculated based on the amounts that we actually track during the course of a period, it will make a fundamental difference if we either calculate the savings rate actively as the percentage of the disposable income that we have actually allocated to the savings categories, or passively as the percentage of disposable income that we have not allocated to expenses. Assuming we have a certain amount of disposable income at the beginning of a period, then calculating the savings rate as the percentage of disposable income that is actually allocated to savings would make the savings rate start at 0% at the beginning of the period and then gradually increase towards its final state at the end of the period. While when calculating the savings rate as the percentage of disposable income that has not been allocated to expenses so far, this is switched around, And we start with a savings rate of 100%, which then slowly decreases over the course of the period until it reaches its final state at the end of the period. So you see, depending on the situation and the way your actual money flows look like, either one or the other way of calculation might be better. And to make the selection you make here accessible in all other sheets, let's assign the cell the global name Savings Rate Calculation Type. And also add a short description that explains the decision to take here. For that description, let's insert another row so that we have 3 rows to merge into one coherent description area, for which we then set the text alignment to the left and top, reduce the font size, change the font color to this dark gray, and finally make the font style italic. Then we enter a quick description text that explains how the savings rate will be calculated, if we either select the active or the passive option. And then we jump over to the calculation sheet and start building that savings rate formula. In that formula, we first check if the savings rate calculation type equals percentage allocated to savings. In that case, we calculate it as a total tracked savings amount divided by the total tracked income amount that are effective in the selected period. And in case the other savings rate calculation type has been chosen, we calculate the savings rate passively as the difference between the total income and the total tracked expenses in brackets divided by the total tracked income effective in the selected period. And since both these calculations include a division by income and this tracked income can be 0, let's wrap this whole statement in an if-error function to catch potential division by 0 errors. And in case of an error, we simply return a dash. Great! At the moment, the selected period is total year, and for this year we have tracked 13,600 in disposable income, of which we so far have only allocated 3,090 to savings. Accordingly, with the savings rate calculation type currently set to the active option, the savings rate here is 22.7%. When we now change that savings rate calculation type to percentage not allocated to expenses, however, not only the savings position, but also the amount left to be allocated that is visible here as the period tracking balance is taken into account. For that reason, the savings rate is much higher here at the moment, but keep in mind that at the end of a period, the savings rate will be more or less the same with both ways of calculating it, given that the period tracking balance comes close to 0. As I prefer the active way of calculating it, let's put that in place. And then with the savings rate value now available in the calculation sheet, let's create the respective tile using the previous tile as a blueprint. Again, we position that new tile at a lower position and then also select one of the others to align the new tile to the same top edge. Now that we have the total number of tiles available in here for the first time, let's quickly make sure that we have a consistent spacing between each of them that is similar to the spacing in between the budget tracking tiles. So maybe we move this one a bit to the right, then move those two together a bit more to the left, and eventually slightly increase the size of the tile background shape of that initial tile. That looks pretty clean to me, so we can continue with setting up the individual elements of that last tile for the savings rate. This will be a lot easier if we ungroup the elements first, then we start the modification with changing the title to Period Savings Rate. As the next step, we're gonna remove the reference in the formula bar from this descriptive text box as in this tile we want to have a static text for which we're going to restore the font size to be 10.5. And the static text will be actually divided into a front part before the savings rate, for which we enter "you are saving." And then we just make this descriptive text box and the value text box switch places. After that, we're gonna change the reference for this value text box to now reference our calculated savings rate in the calculation sheet. And then we not only restore the font size of 12 and the bold text style, but we also align this value to the center, and this time also change the font color to be this beautiful blue that we associate with savings in this template. Maybe let's slightly adjust the size of that value text box and move it a little closer to this front text. And finally, we duplicate that front text box to make the sentence complete. First, we align that second text snippet to the same vertical position, and then replace the text with "of your income," so that the full sentence reads as "you are saving X% of your income." And after a few final positional adjustments to those text boxes, and a slight reduction of the tile background size, we can regroup all these tile elements quickly test how this new tile's content adjusts when we go through the few periods for which we have some tracked sample data. That looks good for January and February. For March we obviously have no tracked savings yet, so 0% makes absolute sense. And finally the total year again, which provides us the most evened out insight for this KPI. And at that point we have completed the creation of this Ultimate Excel personal budget template. There are only 2 finishing touches you need to put to this template before actually taking it into production and applying it for managing your personal budget. And this is at first changing the value of the current date name from this currently hard-coded date we see right here and which made absolutely sense during the development of the template, to the dynamic today formula, which always will return the actual current date. And as a final obvious step, we're gonna hide those 2 supporting worksheets for the drop-down data and the calculations. And that is it for this tutorial. If you want to download the Ultimate Excel Personal Budget template, it is available on excelfind.com. Link for that is in the description. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'd be more than curious to learn what additional features you would love to see in this personal budget template. Let me know in the comments. Any constructive feedback is appreciated. And with that being said, I wish you a beautiful day and see you next time. Cheers!